Out of fuel, Avianca Flight 052 barrels down towards a small town near New York City. A supposedly short flight, how did Flight 052 run out of fuel despite having more than 20,000 pounds worth of extra fuel? January 1990. Parked at Bogota's El Dorado International Airport, Avianca Flight 052 is preparing for a flight to New York City. Flight 52 is being flown with a 22-year-old Boeing 707-321B registered as Hotel Kilo 2016. The plane was manufactured in June 1967, originally meant for Pan Am. Pan Am then sold the plane to Avianca back in February 1977. After they bought the plane from Pan Am, they retrofitted the 707 with a modification to reduce the noise from the engines. The plane had around 61,764 flight hours by January 1990. In the cockpit, we have 51-year-old Captain Laureano Coviedes Hoyos, who had 16,000 flight hours with over 1,500 hours in the 707. Next is 28-year-old First Officer Mauricio Clotz, who had 1,337 flight hours, and 45-year-old Flight Engineer Matias Moyano, who had over 10,000 total flight hours, with 3,000 of them being in the 707. Along with the 6th flight crew are over 6 cabin crew members to handle the 149 passengers, with 27 children on board the flight. It's the afternoon on January 25, 1990 on Bogota's El Dorado International Airport. Avianca Flight 052 is preparing for a 4-hour flight to New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport with a stopover at Medellin, Colombia. And at Bogota, the plane was loaded with 70,000 pounds of fuel. Flight 052 took off from Bogota at 1:10 p.m. bound for Medellin, arriving 5 minutes early at 2:04 p.m. In Medellin, the plane arrived with 61,200 pounds of remaining fuel. They refueled the plane to around 70,000 pounds of fuel, with 56,000 delegated for the direct flight to New York City, 7,600 pounds for their alternate, which in Flight 052's case is Boston, which is 193 nautical miles from New York, 48,000 pounds for holding time, and the rest is reserved for around 6 hours worth of flight time with their fuel load. Avianca Flight 052 took off from Medellin, bound for New York City an hour after they landed at 3:08 p.m. The plane climbed to 37,000 feet heading north. Their flight plan would lead them towards the Bahamas before following along the US East Coast to JFK. Flight 052 entered Miami's airspace at 5:28 p.m. at around 35,000 feet. While in Miami airspace, they climbed to 37,000 feet as they proceeded across the Atlantic East Coast. At 7:04 p.m., while the plane was near Norfolk, Virginia, the plane was put into a holding pattern for 19 minutes until 7:23 p.m. After that, Flight 052 continued flying north before being put on another holding pattern near Atlantic City, New Jersey for another 29 minutes from 7:43 to 8:12 before going northbound again. At that point, the plane had been flying for more than 5 hours, burning through a majority of their fuel by now. They descended to 14,000 feet before being put on another holding pattern 39 nautical miles south of JFK for another 29 minutes from 8:18 p.m. to 8:47. In the holding pattern, Flight 052 descended to 11,000 feet. They were running through their reserves at this point, flying for nearly 6 hours by then. At 8:44, while the aircraft was still holding south of JFK, the first officer asked for priority towards the ATC, since at that point they had burned through a majority of their fuel. ATC then responded asking how long they can hold and whether they can reach their alternate airport. The pilots responded that they didn't have a lot of remaining time and how Boston was likely too far gone and crowded at that point. At 8:46, the controller told New York's Terminal Radar Approach, or TRACON, about Flight 052's predicament. They told the controller to slow Flight 052 down to 180 knots and fly them on a 40-degree heading. At 20:46:47, the controller cleared Flight 052 to fly towards JFK, with them leaving the holding pattern at around 8:47 p.m. The New York TRACON instructed the Flight 052 to descend to lower altitudes as they flew towards JFK. The controller put them into a spin pattern at 8:54 p.m., also warning about wind shear near JFK. They told Flight 052 to switch to frequency 118.4 as they continued to descend till 2,000 feet. pilots discussed their go-around procedure since their fuel was less than 1,000 pounds by now. They put their flaps to 14 degrees at 9:11 p.m., then to 25 degrees a minute later. At the same time, they swapped to JFK's tower frequency as they established ILS on runway 22 left. Flight 052 was number 3, preceding a Boeing 727 on a 9-mile final. The pilots lowered the plane's gear at 9:19 p.m. and put their flaps to 40 degrees. At 9:20, they lowered their flaps to 50 degrees as they approached the runway. At 9:22, while they were 1,000 feet up, they had encountered wind shear. For 15 seconds from 9:23:08 to 9:23:23, the plane's ground proximity warning system was sounding and they started to deviate from the glide slope path. They had lost sight of the runway and had to perform a missed approach despite being dangerously low on fuel. At 9:23:24, they informed JFK, which told them to climb to 2,000 feet and fly north to try again. At this point, the controllers weren't aware of Flight 052's fuel situation. They told Flight 052 to climb to 3,000 feet and to fly 15 miles northeast to try going on approach again. At 9:30, they told Flight 052 to head 360 degrees north and set their flaps to 14 degrees. As they continued north at 9:31 p.m. near the coast of Long Island, they were told to turn to 330 degrees. But a few minutes later at 9:32, engine 4 flamed out from fuel exhaustion, with engine 3 flaming out a few seconds later. They informed the controller asking to give them priority seeing their situation. They were told to turn to 250 degrees towards JFK. The plane started turning, heading south towards Cove Neck, New York. At 9:33:23, Avianca 52 had their last transmission to air traffic control, acknowledging an instruction on their ILS. A second later, the CVR stopped recording, and presumably all of their engines flamed out and their power was completely cut off. Flight 052 was left in the dark as they continued descending down towards the hill. At 9:34, Flight 052 gets close enough to clip trees and posts on the ground before impacting a hillside. The aircraft was split into 3 main parts upon impact, with the cockpit and front portion of the cabin being flung past the hillside. The rest of the plane slid down the hillside with no fire from the lack of fuel to ignite, with some of the debris breaking a wooden deck of a nearby house. Considering Flight 052 crashed in a residential area, the residents of Cove Neck called the emergency services when the plane crashed. Out of the plane's 152 occupants, 73 of them were killed in the crash. 81 had serious injuries and the rest received minor injuries. First responders arrived at the site around an hour and a half due to narrow roadways leading towards the crash site. Rescue helicopters had to be grounded for a few hours due to fog around the area. Critical and seriously injured passengers couldn't be airlifted till around 11:30 p.m., with many passengers still being strapped to their seats when the plane crashed. With the area being swarmed with vehicles and people, the area got congested for a few hours. The rescue effort was chaotic, as rescuers were radioing where to send survivors. Due to that, 3 passengers who were found alive later died to their injuries. The investigation into Flight 052 was led by the National Transportation Safety Board, or NTSB, and a separate investigation from Colombia's Departamento Administrado de Aviación Civil, or DAAC. Flight 052's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder were recovered intact, but the plane's flight data recorder was inoperative, so they had to rely on ATC records and the plane's CVR to determine what happened to the crash. But even so, the CVR and ATC records managed to provide lots of info. The NTSB published their final report on April 30th, 1991, over a year after the plane crashed. In the report, they mainly attribute the crash to miscommunication between ATC and the crew, mainly on the part of the crew. But there is some controversy surrounding the NTSB's report that I'll come into later. In the CVR and ATC logs, the pilots were using priority instead of any of the main terms such as emergency, mayday, or pan-pan. For that, the ATC wasn't fully aware of Flight 052's fuel situation, so they weren't able to prioritize Flight 052, leading to delay after delay until they ran out of fuel and crashed. There were also contributing factors to the accident in the NTSB's report, one of them being the pilot's inability to land the plane in their first approach, the wind shear, and recurring maintenance issues with the plane's autopilot as other possible factors. However, there was some controversy on the NTSB's report, as some think they didn't address the ATC's role in the crash of Flight 052. They state that they didn't pay much attention or put focus on the controllers handling the flight. Along with that, the Colombian DAAC recommended to place some responsibility on the controller's, quote, mishandling of Flight 052, and some of the NTSB's officers were criticizing the FAA's role on allowing a lot more traffic than JFK could handle. In the aftermath, 2 passengers for Flight 052 were arrested as they were found to be smuggling cocaine on board by swallowing containers of the substance and transporting them to the US. They were sentenced to prison ranging from 6 to 7 years to life in prison. Some of the crash survivors sued the FAA, and there were some demonstrations protesting the handling of the flight. Avianca later offered $75,000 to survivors or the families of the victims, with the American government later joining in for a total settlement of $200 million worth of damages. Avianca has not retired the flight number 052. As of now, it's being used on the flight from Lima to Bogota, with the direct flight between Bogota and New York City designated as Flight 210, 244, and 020 now being operated with Airbus A320s. After the reports were published, the NTSB recommended the FAA collaborate with the International Civil Aviation, or ICAO, to create a system and standard of terms for emergency and communication purposes, to prevent another accident like Avianca Flight 052 from happening ever again. Hey guys, sorry it's been a while. It's currently the middle of second quarter here in class, and also I've had a cough for nearly 3 weeks and we've been getting hit by typhoons like every week or so. Anyways, hope you enjoyed. That's it. Bye!